I have kept a running log of every transit case that crossed my desk at carrath-pell for 11 years. Not because anyone asked me to, the hub's own system holds the official record, and my paper log duplicates nothing that couldn't be found in the archive. I keep it because the work is repetitive by design and the mind needs something to hold. A line per case, sometimes two. Name, origin, purpose of transit, disposition. Clear, denied, flagged for review. That is the job. I have added 7 words to the case file I opened for a mid-rank customs attaché named Solon Verath on the 14th day of the 3rd transit cycle. Those 7 words are not in the hub system. They exist only in my paper log. In the column I have titled Notes Personal, which no auditor has ever asked to see and which I would hand over without hesitation if they did. The 7 words are, known from the Pell-Carrath integration file, proceeding as filed. I have thought about those 7 words a great deal in the months since she left. I am not sure they were the right words. I am not sure there were better ones. I will start at the beginning, because the beginning is the only place that makes sense. Carrath-pell Transit Hub sits at the junction of 2 mid-rim freight corridors, the Carrath-Selen and the Pell-Outer, and handles approximately 12,000 transits per cycle. Level 4 is the import clearance floor. It is not the hub's most prestigious address. The senior clearance officers work level 7, where the lighting is better and the chairs have backs. Level 4 has low ceilings, a ceiling-mounted ventilation grid that produces a faint metallic hum on cold days, and a corridor of clearance desks assigned by seniority. Which is to say, the most junior officer gets the desk nearest the cargo lifts, and I, having neither sought nor received a promotion in 4 years, occupy desk 12, which is near enough to the lifts that I can hear them cycle throughout the shift. I do not mind the lifts. They give the day a rhythm. A cycle of the cargo lift means a new batch of physical freight documents coming up from the dock level, which means a new stack on the collection tray beside my desk, which means work. I have found, over 11 years at various clearance desks, that work is easier to manage when it arrives in discrete batches rather than as a continuous stream. The cargo lifts at carrath-pell deliver batches. Adjacent to the clearance corridor, separated by a half-wall of frosted panel, is the copper kettle. It is not a proper cafe in any sense that would satisfy someone accustomed to proper cafes. It is a row of standing-height tables, a self-service dispenser for hot beverages, and 4 chairs pulled up against the window that looks out over the approach dock. The window runs floor to ceiling and gives an unobstructed view of the docking cradles, the amber sweep of the hub's exterior lighting, and on clear approach days, the first light of inbound ships resolving out of the transit haze. The chair nearest the left edge of the window has a slight rocking quality because the floor tile beneath it is fractionally uneven. The building maintenance team has been made aware of this. The tile has not been corrected. I have mentioned it in my desk log under the heading Building Issues Unresolved on 3 separate occasions, and on each occasion I have received an automated acknowledgement and nothing else. I mention this now because it matters later, though not in a way I could have predicted when I first logged it. She appeared at my desk on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I had the level 4 schedule in front of me. Supply manifests from 2 Carrath corridor freighters due that afternoon, and Thursdays are when the bulk freighters arrive, and the manifests run long, and the afternoon gets compressed. She was not a bulk freighter contact. She was a mid-rank customs attaché from the Solon trade delegation, filing a standard transit purpose declaration for a 3-week observer posting at carrath-pell. Observer postings are routine. Delegations send junior functionaries to waystation hubs to monitor trade corridor flow, note compliance patterns, file reports. I process 2 or 3 per cycle. They almost never speak to me except to clarify a field on the form. She placed the declaration on the desk. It was filled out correctly. The Galactic Commerce Register's Form CT7, the right revision, all fields completed, the delegation seal in the lower left corner where the seal goes. She stood with her hands at her sides, not exactly at attention but not at ease either. Something in between. Her posture was the posture of someone accustomed to waiting for things to be processed and accustomed to no one taking longer than necessary. I read the form. Name, Solon Verath. Origin, Veth Delegation Outer Rim Trade Consulate. Purpose, Observer Posting. Duration, 21 standard days with optional extension to 30. Clearance Tier, Delegate 3. I stamped it, logged it, handed it back with the corridor pass printed on a standard transit slip. The whole transaction took 4 minutes. The copper kettle is through the panel on your left if you need to wait for anything, I said. I said this to everyone. It was not an invitation so much as orientation. The chair by the left edge of the window rocks a little. I'd recommend the one too along from it. She looked at the panel, then back at me. Her eyes were a pale copper color, the kind that reads amber in direct light and almost gray in shadow. Her skin was a cool gray lavender, the sort that the transit hub's functional overhead lighting did no favors to, but which the window light, I would later notice, picked up cleanly. She had dark hair braided close and pinned at the back, and she wore the Veth Delegation's attaché uniform, a slate gray coat with narrow collar, cuffs, and the delegation pip at the left breast. The coat was well made and clearly worn in. It had the particular quality of a garment that has been through many transit environments and has not suffered from it. Some people's travel coats look borrowed. This one looked like hers. She did not say anything to my comment about the chair. She picked up her corridor pass and her stamped form and walked to the copper kettle. She took the second chair from the left edge, the one I had suggested. She got a cup of something hot from the dispenser and sat with it and looked out the window at the approach dock. I went back to the freight manifests. That was the beginning of it, and at that moment I had no idea it was the beginning of anything, because nothing about it was unusual. A delegation attaché filed a transit form. I processed it. She waited in the cafe. Standard Thursday afternoon at desk 12. But here is what I had not told her, and what I did not tell her in any of the weeks that followed. 7 months before that Thursday, I had been asked to run a cross-reference on a Pell-outer integration file. This was also routine work. The integration files are trade corridor reconciliations, matching delegation registration records against the hub's own traffic log to flag discrepancies. Most discrepancies are clerical. A form filed under the wrong revision, a delegation pip recorded at the wrong tier, a transit date logged a day off because someone's terminal was running on Carrath local time instead of hub standard. I had run 60-odd of these cross-references over the previous 2 cycles and flagged 31 minor discrepancies, none of which amounted to anything more serious than a correction note sent to the relevant delegation desk. The 60-second cross-reference was for a Veth outer delegation file. The registration record looked ordinary, but when I ran the name and pip combination against the GCR's deeper identity layer, which I do for every Veth file, because the Veth outer delegation had submitted 3 pip-tier discrepancies in the previous cycle, and I had been asked to be thorough, the result that came back was not a discrepancy flag. It was a full verification lock. A verification lock means the system has matched the submitted identity against a sealed record and confirmed the match, and that the sealed record carries a restriction level that prevents the system from displaying its contents to a Delegate 3 clearance operator, which I was. The lock does not tell you what is in the sealed record. It tells you only that the match was confirmed and that you do not have clearance to see why it matters. I sat with the verification lock for a while. I have a habit of sitting with things before acting on them. Some of my colleagues at carrath-pell find this quality irritating in a transit officer, where the premium is generally on speed and throughput. I find that most decisions which feel urgent are not actually urgent, and that the extra minutes spent looking at a problem before responding to it reliably produce better responses. This is not a philosophy I have ever articulated to anyone at the hub. It is simply how I work. I had seen 2 verification locks in 11 years, both for outer rim diplomatic personnel traveling under protected status. a galactic court arbitration witness once, and a treaty-bound trade commissioner the other time. Neither had come through carrath-pell in person. Both had been flagged by the integration file and referred upward to Level 7, where the senior officers had the clearance tier to open the sealed record and determine whether additional protocol was required. The correct procedure, having encountered a verification lock, was to refer the file to Level 7 and write a referral note in the system log. I typed the referral note, I saved it, and then I sat there for another few minutes looking at the verification lock, and I thought about the two previous cases I had seen, the arbitration witness and the trade commissioner, and the way those referrals had gone. The referrals had not been discreet. The senior officers on Level 7 had opened the sealed records, determined the relevant protocol, and then applied it, which in both cases had meant notifying the relevant delegation and adjusting the individual's transit handling to reflect their actual status, which was the correct thing to do. But I had also been on the docking level the day the trade commissioner came through, because I had been sent to collect a manifest, and I had watched the way the senior clearance team had assembled on the dock with the protocol officer and the hub's deputy administrator, and the way the trade commissioner had looked at all of them waiting for him, and the way his face had done something very careful and very controlled before he composed it back to neutral and submitted to the reception. He had been there for a specific purpose. He had planned to arrive quietly, do his work, and leave. And the referral had made that impossible, and he had understood that it had made it impossible, and he had submitted to what the protocol required of him, and his face in the moment before he composed it had been the face of someone absorbing the cost of something they had not chosen. I thought about that face for a while. I thought about the verification lock in front of me, and the restriction tier, which was higher than anything I had seen on a Level 7 referral before, and I thought about what it meant that someone who warranted that tier of restriction had filed as a Delegate 3 Customs attaché. It meant they had made a deliberate choice, a well-considered one. They had not made a filing error. They had made a decision about the terms of their transit, and they had executed it correctly, and they had done it knowing that the GCR's integration system might flag it, and that the flag would produce exactly the referral I was now contemplating. The question I found myself asking was, what would a referral actually accomplish in this specific case? The sealed record would tell Level 7 who the filer really was. Level 7 would assemble the protocol team. The protocol team would be ready at the docking cradle when the filer arrived, and the filer would walk into that assembly, and their face would do the same thing the trade commissioner's face had done, and they would submit, because you cannot not submit when the protocol team is standing there waiting. What would that accomplish? The filing had no compliance issue. The form was correctly completed. The posting purpose was legitimate. Observer postings are legitimate regardless of the actual rank of the observer. There was no fraud, no concealment for illegal purpose, no harm to the hub or the corridor or anyone transiting it. There was only a person who had decided, for reasons the restriction tier suggested were well above my clearance to understand, to travel as someone other than who they were. I deleted the referral note. I wrote in the system log, cross-reference complete, no discrepancy flagged, file closed. And in my paper log in the notes personal column I wrote 8 words, Pell Carrath integration file 7-7 veth. Verification lock confirmed. Proceeding as filed. No referral. I want to be clear about what I understood and what I did not understand at that moment. I did not understand the details of the sealed record. I did not know names or titles or the specific nature of the identity behind the lock. What I understood was structural. Whoever had registered under that VETH outer delegation record had done so deliberately, using a registration that was correct in all its particulars, but that sat on top of something else, something sealed, something they had chosen to cover. And they had not come through carrath-pell yet. The integration file was prospective. It was reconciling projected delegation traffic against registration records, not actual arrivals. Whoever it was had filed to come here, and had filed as someone other than who they were. I decided, for reasons I examined carefully at the time and have examined again many times since, that the most useful thing I could do was nothing. Not nothing out of negligence. Nothing out of respect for a choice that had clearly been made with intention, and that the verification lock suggested was backed by a tier of authority well above anything on level 4 of carrath-pell. If someone at that tier of authority had decided to travel this corridor as a Delegate 3 customs attaché, there was a reason for it. It was not my reason to understand. My job was to process the transit correctly when they arrived, which I would do, and to not make their transit more complicated than they had chosen it to be, which I could manage by simply doing what I always did: stamping forms correctly, giving sensible directions, and minding my own desk. I had not thought at the time that the person in question would ever sit in the chair by the window in the copper kettle and look out at the approach dock, while I worked through freight manifests 10 feet away. But there she was, and there I was, and I processed her CT7 correctly and recommended the chair 2 along from the left edge, and that was that. She came back the following Tuesday. This was not unusual. Observer postings require weekly desk check-ins, a routine compliance requirement I could have told her about on Thursday if she had asked, but she hadn't asked, and I had not volunteered it because the corridor pass she received on Thursday contained the schedule and the standard footer text. She presented the weekly check-in form. I stamped it, updated the log, handed it back. "Is there a quiet hour?" she asked. It was the first full sentence she had directed at me. "What do you mean by quiet?" "The corridor, the clearance floor, when is it least busy?" "Between 1100 and 1300, I said. "The morning rush clears by 10:30, and the afternoon freight doesn't start filing until 13:15 or so. The cafe is also quietest then. The window gets the best light around 11:30. She looked at me the way she had looked at me on Thursday, which was directly and without expression. Then she said, "Thank you," and went to the copper kettle. She took the second chair again. She had the same cup of something hot. She sat for about 40 minutes, watching the approach dock, and then she left. On Friday she came at 11:20. This was, as I had told her, the quiet hour, and the corridor was nearly empty and the cafe had no one in it. I was working through a stack of commodity certificates, small trader filings, the kind that take 2 minutes each but arrive in batches of 30, and I did not look up when she came in. She went to the copper kettle, got her cup, took the second chair, and looked out the window. I noticed, without particularly intending to notice, that she held the cup with both hands when she was looking out at the dock. Not for warmth particularly. The hub ran level 4 at a standard temperature that was neither cold nor warm, and the coat she wore was adequate for it. It seemed more like a habit or a way of being still. She sat very straight. Most people, given a chair by a window with nothing required of them for an hour, slump. They let their shoulders come forward and their spines curve, and they settle into the chair rather than sitting on it. She did not slump. She sat as if she were attending to something, though what she was attending to was the ordinary business of the approach dock: cradles opening and closing, tugs guiding short-haul freighters into position, the slow turn of a mid-corridor passenger transport settling into its berth. I found myself thinking, around noon, that this was an unusual way to spend a quiet hour at a waystation hub. Most observer posting delegates who came through the level 4 cafe used the time to work on their reports, or to make comm connections, or simply to rest in the way that transiting people rest, without much focus, waiting for the next thing. She did none of these. She sat and watched the dock with the same quality of attention she had given my desk when she filed the CT7, not distracted, not resting, present. I went back to the commodity certificates and told myself it was not my business how a Delegate 3 observer spent her cafe time. At some point, I would estimate 11:45, she got up and came to stand near my desk. Not at it, near it, the way someone stands when they are not sure whether to interrupt. "Is there anything useful I can read?" she said. About the carrath-pell corridor flow, publicly available summaries, not proprietary data. I'm supposed to be writing an observer report. I thought about this. The hub publishes a quarterly corridor summary on the transit board outside Level 4. It's about 3 months out of date by the time it goes up, but it covers the standard metrics. There's also an annual trade flow digest from the GCR. I can tell you which terminal to query. That would be useful. I told her the terminal number and the query path. She wrote it down in a small notebook she took from her coat pocket. The notebook was the kind with a dark cover and narrow pages, the sort you could buy at the commissary on Level 2 for half a credit. She wrote in it with a short pen that she returned to the same coat pocket when she was done. The handwriting was small and tight, not hurried. "Thank you," she said again, and went back to the window. I processed 6 more commodity certificates. I thought, as I processed them, about nothing in particular. This is a state I can achieve at clearance work that I cannot always achieve elsewhere. The forms occupy enough of my attention that the rest of my mind becomes quiet rather than occupied. She stayed until 12:40 and left without saying anything further. The following week settled into a pattern that I became aware of gradually, because patterns at clearance desks reveal themselves through repetition, and repetition takes time. She came on Tuesday for the check-in. She came on Thursday and Friday between 11 and 12:30. She always took the second chair. She always got a cup from the dispenser, pressed grain tea, I noticed eventually, because the dispenser labels its selections, and she always used the same one. She always sat straight and watched the dock, and held the cup with both hands when she was not drinking from it. On the Thursday of the second week, she was already in the cafe when I arrived at the desk at 8:40. She had not been there at 7 when I opened. I come in early on Thursdays because of the freight manifests, but sometime between 7 and 8:40 she had come in, gotten her cup, and taken the second chair. She was not watching the dock that morning. She was looking at the notebook, reading something she had written earlier. I did not speak to her, and she did not look up until the check-in on Tuesday had already come and gone, at which point she left without using the cafe. On the Tuesday of the third week, the Level 4 corridor was busier than usual. A compliance audit from a regional GCR office had sent 3 inspector teams through Level 4, and the clearance desks were running at double tempo. I had been at it since 700, and by 11 I had cleared 46 transit forms and was working on the 47th when she arrived for her check-in. I stamped her form without looking up, updated the log, handed it back, and then realized I had not told her the copper kettle was closed. The cafe's dispenser was being serviced that morning, which I had known since 700, and had simply not thought to mention when she appeared at my desk. "Copper kettle is closed today," I said. "Dispenser maintenance should be back by 1300. She had already turned toward the panel. She stopped. "The dispensers on Level 2 are better anyway," I said. "They have the pressed grain option. Third corridor on the left once you come off the lift." She looked at me. I had already looked back at the 47th form. "I'll be on Level 2, she said after a moment. "I'll note it," I said, which was something I said to couriers and inspectors when they needed to be findable during a check-in period. I had not thought about why I said it to her. It was simply the thing you said. She left. I finished the stack of 47 forms and started on the next batch, which the cargo lift delivered at 11:30 with its customary machinery sound. The compliance auditors were still moving through the corridor at 12. At 12:50 they finished and the corridor quieted abruptly, the way it does when a large group leaves simultaneously. She came back at 13:10, when the dispenser was back online. She got her cup and took the second chair and sat for 30 minutes, and then she left without saying anything. I noted, without remarking on it to anyone, that she had come back for the 30 minutes rather than not coming. She had already satisfied the technical check-in requirement for the week. There was no procedural reason to return to Level 4 in the afternoon. She had returned anyway and sat for 30 minutes and left. I turned back to the compliance audit documentation I was supposed to be reviewing and reviewed it. The auditors had found 2 minor discrepancies in the level 4 log, both clerical. I wrote correction notes for both and filed them before the end of shift. On the Thursday of the 3rd week, she arrived at 11:15 and stood at my desk and said, "May I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The Level 7 clearance officers, they handle protected status transits." I set down the form I was reading. I looked at her for the first time that morning. Her expression was the same as it always was, flat, careful, neither cold nor warm. But something in the question itself had shifted the register of the conversation slightly, and I had learned, in the weeks she had been coming to the desk, that her questions were rarely exactly what they appeared to be. They were accurate in their phrasing. They were also always pointing at something adjacent to what they literally asked. "They do," I said. "If a transit form were filed at Delegate 3, and the transit officer processing it had reason to believe the filer's actual status was above Delegate 3, what is the correct procedure?" The corridor was quiet. It was the quiet hour. The ventilation grid hummed its usual note above us. "Correct procedure is to flag the file for Level 7 review," I said. "The Level 7 team has the clearance tier to access sealed identity records and determine whether additional protocol is required." She held my gaze. She was very good at not showing things, but something had shifted slightly in the way she was looking at me. Something that was not quite a question and not quite an accusation and not quite something else, but that occupied a space I did not have a precise word for. "And if the transit officer had already processed the file as Delegate 3, she said carefully, and had not referred it to Level 7, then the transit officer would have to have a good reason for that," I said, "or at minimum a documented reason. And if they did have a documented reason, then the file would reflect the decision, and the decision would stand unless it was reviewed and overturned." She was quiet for a moment. I waited. I am good at waiting in the same way and for the same reasons that I am good at sitting with things before acting on them. "What would constitute a good reason," she said, "for not referring it?" I thought about this as I would think about any procedural question, which is to say, carefully and without hurry. "A transit officer might determine," I said, "that the filer had made a deliberate and well-considered choice about the terms of their transit, and that those terms had been correctly filed, and that there was no compliance breach to address, and that the most useful action was to respect the terms that had been set." She said nothing. "That's a documented reason," I said. "It's not the standard one, but it holds." She looked at the desk between us. She looked at the stamp I used, which was a standard GCR Level 4 transit stamp, worn at the edges because I had been using it for 11 years. She looked at the paper log that sat to my left, open to the current week, and then she looked up at me. "You would have logged that," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes. In the system. The system shows the file was processed as filed and closed. No discrepancy." "And separately?" "Yes," I said, "separately." She held my gaze for another moment. Then she said, "Thank you," in the same tone she always used, and went to the copper kettle and took the second chair and sat with her cup and looked out at the approach dock. I went back to work. My hands were steady. The next form in the stack was a standard small trader commodity certificate, and I stamped it and logged it and set it aside and reached for the one after it. What I was thinking about was not the procedure, and not the log and not the file. What I was thinking about was the approach dock visible through the window, and the way she was looking at it, and what it might mean to look at a place the way she was looking at it, steadily, with the kind of attention you give something that will not be in your field of view for much longer. I had not thought until that morning that the 30-day posting was most of the way through. I thought about it now. She stayed until 12:50. She left without saying anything further, and I noted the time in the log for no particular reason, only that I was logging times that day because of the compliance audit follow-up, and my hand was already in the habit of it. The fourth week brought a change in the corridor traffic pattern. Two of the Carrath corridor freight companies had updated their routing for the season, which pushed their arrival windows earlier in the day, and meant that the 11 to 13 quiet hour was no longer as quiet as it had been. On the Monday, I came in to find the corridor already running at three-quarter pace at 10:30, and I spent the first 2 hours of the quiet window processing a stack of updated freight manifests before I could get back to the standard transit forms. The Level 4 corridor had not run this busy in a standard cycle since the carrath-pell rerouting 18 months prior, and I found the pace taxing in the way that any departure from an established rhythm is taxing, not unmanageable, but requiring more active attention to maintain the same quality of output. On the Tuesday, she came for the check-in and found the corridor running at full pace. She came to my desk without hesitation, filed the form, waited for the stamp, took the corridor pass. "I may have 3 more weeks rather than 2, she said. "I'll note it in the system. You'll need to file an extension request, Form CT9, Revision 4. I can have one ready if you want to file it now." "Not now. I'll file it by Thursday." "That's fine. The 30-day window is still open." She took the stamped form and looked at the corridor, which was noisy with freight agents and their assistants, and 2 GCR compliance inspectors comparing something on matching tablets. "The cafe," she said, "should still be quieter through the panel," I said. "The freight agents don't usually go through to the copper kettle." "Good." She went through. I watched the corner of the window for a moment. The frosted section of the panel was below eye level from my desk, but I could see the upper corner of the window and the approach dock in the mid-morning light, which was a low amber because the hub's exterior lights had not yet adjusted for the angle of the local sun. It occurred to me, watching that corner, that I had developed a habit of glancing at the window when she was sitting there. Not watching, glancing. There is a difference. Watching requires sustained attention. A glance is a check, a brief confirmation that a thing is where it is expected to be. I checked, occasionally, that she was where she was expected to be. I did not examine this closely. She did not file the CT9 extension on Thursday. She came in at 11:15 and took the second chair and looked out the window for 50 minutes, and when she left she stopped briefly at my desk and said, "I won't need the extension." "Understood," I said. "I won't flag the option in the system." She looked at me. The corridor was busy again. A freight agent 3 desks down was disputing a commodity code at volume. "Thank you," she said, and then quietly, "for the chair recommendation as well." I looked up at her. It was perhaps the most unexpected sentence she had directed at me in 4 weeks, and I was not entirely sure how to respond to it, which is unusual for me. I tend to know what to say in transit corridor interactions. They have a predictable grammar. "You always took the second one," I said. "The one I recommended. I wasn't sure you actually preferred it or just defaulted to the first recommendation you received." "Both," she said. "It was the right chair and I defaulted to the recommendation." "Fair enough." She left. I filed the day's forms. I thought about the way she had said it, for the chair recommendation as well, and the word as well, which implied that there were other things she was also expressing thanks for, and which she had not specified. I had not asked her to specify. Some things do not improve under pressure to become more explicit. What they are is already understood, and saying so aloud adds nothing to the understanding, and takes something away from the quality of the silence in which the understanding lives. The following 2 weeks settled into what I can only describe as a kind of professional steadiness. She came Tuesdays for check-ins, Thursdays and Fridays for the quiet hour. She asked questions when she had them, about corridor flow patterns, about the commodity classification system, about the specific difference between a standard observer posting and a technical review posting. I explained it. The differences are procedural and not very interesting, but she listened to the whole explanation with the same quality of attention she gave everything, which made explaining a dull thing feel less dull than it usually does. There was one conversation that sits differently in my memory than the others. It was a Friday, 3 weeks before her posting ended. She had been at the window for about half an hour when she got up and came to stand near my desk in the way she did when she was about to ask something. "What made you take a level 4 desk?" she said. It was not a transit procedure question. I looked up. "How do you mean?" "You've been here 11 years. Level 4 is not where an 11-year officer ends up if they're moving through the system normally." "No," I said, "it isn't." She waited. She was good at waiting. "I had a level 6 post," I said, 8 years ago. Corridor analysis, not clearance. It was the kind of work that required a lot of interaction with delegation officers and trade commission representatives, people who were used to being handled in specific ways. And I was not very good at handling them in the specific ways they were used to being handled in. I was good at the analysis. I was not good at the surrounding performance. She looked at me for a moment. "What kind of performance?" "The kind where you treat someone's stated rank as the primary fact about them at all times, in all interactions, regardless of context. The kind where you calibrate everything, the tone, the speed, the amount of eye contact based on the tier number on their credential." "You found that difficult." "I found it accurate but incomplete," I said. "People's stated rank is one thing about them. It's not the only thing. And in my experience, treating it as the only thing produces worse outcomes than treating the person as a person and the rank as a relevant piece of information. And Level 4 allows you to do that. Level 4 mostly involves people who are trying to get their transit forms processed correctly and their cargo cleared without delays. The rank matters for the form. The person matters for getting through the day without making anyone's life harder than it needs to be." She was quiet for a moment. The ventilation grid hummed. Somewhere on the corridor, a printer cycled through a long document. "That seems like a reasonable way to work," she said. "It suits me," I said. She went back to the window. She sat for another 20 minutes before she left. I processed 6 more forms and thought, occasionally, about the conversation, and about the way she had listened to it, not the way people usually listen to explanations they have solicited, which is with the politely interested expression of someone waiting for the answer to conclude, but with the kind of attention that suggests they are actually thinking about what they are hearing. I had not spoken about the Level 6 post to anyone at carrath-pell. It was not a secret. It was simply not a thing that had come up in 11 years of freight manifests and commodity certificates. I was not accustomed to being asked direct personal questions at the clearance desk, and I found, to my mild surprise, that I had answered this one without difficulty. The following Thursday was the last ordinary Thursday. The one after it would be the last visit. On that last ordinary Thursday, she arrived at 11:10. The corridor was quiet. She got her cup from the copper kettle and took the second chair and sat with it and looked out at the approach dock. I was working through a set of transit summaries, end-of-cycle paperwork, the kind that requires concentration rather than speed. At 12:40 she got up, set her cup on the counter by the dispenser, and came to stand near my desk. "The corridor summary for the next cycle," she said. "The published one, is it up yet?" "It went up Monday," I said. "Same terminal, same query path." "I know," she paused. I looked at it. "All right." "It won't cover what I needed it to cover," she said. "The timing is wrong. The data is 3 months old and the situation on the corridor shifted significantly in the last 6 weeks." I looked up. The freight routing change. Among other things. I thought about what I knew about the corridor situation from 11 years of Level 4 filings. The carrath-pell integration is flagging a lot of non-standard commodity classifications, I said. Started about 8 weeks ago. Small trades mostly, but the pattern is irregular. I flagged it in the commodity audit last month. She looked at me. You noticed that? It's in the level 4 log, I said. I can't tell from the commodity certificates what's driving it, but something in the corridor flow changed in the back half of last cycle, and it's showing up in the classification patterns. Yes, she said, it is. She did not say anything else about it. I had not expected her to. It was the kind of answer that closes a line of conversation rather than opening one, and I recognized it as such. I went back to the transit summaries. She stood for a moment and then she said, in a tone that was not quite the usual tone, "What you said last week, about the level 6 post." Yes. Did it occur to you that there might be people who find the way you work here useful? Not because they don't know how to deal with the performance you described, but because they're tired of it. I held my pen. I thought about the word tired. I thought about what it would mean to be genuinely tired of the performance, not frustrated by it, not resistant to it, but tired, the way you are tired of something you have been doing for a very long time and have become very good at, and that costs you something each time regardless of how good at it you are. The kind of tired that is not loudly expressed. The kind that sits inside ordinary competence and ordinary composure and shows itself only sideways, if it shows at all. Yes, I said, it had occurred to me. She nodded once. She went back to the window and collected her cup empty, but she took it to the recycling point on the counter before she left. She always recycled the cup, every visit, 4 weeks running. The copper kettle's recycling point is not prominently placed. It is at the far end of the counter, away from the dispenser and away from the door. She walked the extra distance every time. I watched the window for a moment after she was gone. The approach dock was quiet in the early afternoon, the cradles mostly empty, one outbound mid-haul transport aligning itself in the number 3 position. The last visit was a Tuesday. I had known it was coming. The posting was at its end date, 30 days from the first Thursday, adjusted for the decision not to file the extension. Level 7 had sent down a corridor flow summary that morning, which happens at the end of observer postings when the GCR reconciles the observer's activity log against the hub's own records. The summary for Solon Verath, Delegate 3, Veth Outer Delegation, observer posting was 3 lines, all compliant, no discrepancies. Posting closed at end of standard period. I had it on my desk when she arrived at 11:20. She was wearing the same slate gray coat, the same delegation pip at the left breast. She carried her notebook, the narrow dark cover one, and she looked the same as she always looked, which is to say contained, precise, and not quite readable. The coat showed, I noticed for perhaps the first time as a distinct observation rather than a general impression, how well traveled it was. Not worn out, worn in. There is a difference, and it is visible in how a garment moves on a person when they have inhabited it long enough. She also carried herself differently today in a way I found difficult to name precisely. She was carrying herself the same way she always did, straight, not stiff, with that quality of composed attention. But there was something underneath it today that was different. I thought about the approach dock I had looked at the day before, the number 3 cradle, the outbound mid-haul transport aligning into position. I thought about what it means to be very close to leaving somewhere. Not with relief, not with regret exactly, but with the particular weight of completion, the sense of a thing having been done as thoroughly as it could be done and now ready to be set down. She placed the final check-in form on my desk. I processed it, stamped it, logged it, marked the posting complete in the system. I printed the exit clearance slip, which is a formality, a single sheet saying the posting has been completed in good standing and the delegate is cleared to transit out of carrath-pell on their registered return. I slid the exit clearance across the desk. She picked it up. She looked at it for a moment in the way she looked at forms, checking the fields, confirming the stamp was in the right place. "It's complete," I said. "You're cleared." "Yes," she said. She folded the exit clearance into her notebook. She stood there for a moment with the notebook in her hands, and I thought she was going to turn and go to the copper kettle for one last cup, and come back to the second chair by the window and sit with the approach dock for a while. She had that look. She did not do that. She stood at my desk and she looked at me, and then she said, in a tone that was careful and deliberate in a way that was different from her usual careful deliberateness, with the quality of something that had been decided before the words were spoken, "My name is Verath Solon." The name on the form had been Solon Verath, reversed. I looked at her. "Empress," she said, "of the Veth sovereignty, third seat." The corridor was quiet. The ventilation grid hummed. I could hear from somewhere below us the muted sound of the approach dock, a cradle cycling, the brief hiss of a docking seal engaging. A large docking seal, larger than anything that had come into Carrath-pell in the 6 weeks since the routing change. I reached for the paper log. I turned it to the entry from 7 months ago, the one in the notes personal column. I did not read it aloud. I turned it to face her on the desk so she could read it herself. She read it twice. The entry was 8 words, Pell Carrath Integration File 7-7 Veth. Verification lock confirmed, proceeding as filed, no referral, 8 words in the notes personal column of a paper log that no auditor had ever asked to see. She read it and she looked up at me. 7 months, she said. Approximately. You processed 5 check-in forms, she said. You recommended the quiet hour. You told me about the level 7 procedure when I asked about it directly. She looked at the entry in the log. You answered every question I asked you as if I had filed as Delegate 3. You did file as Delegate 3, I said. The form was correctly completed. The stamp was applied correctly. The posting was observed and completed in full compliance. Yes, she said, it was. She was quiet for a moment. Something had shifted in her face, not dramatically, not visibly in the way a screen changes when the image changes, but in the subtler way that faces shift when the thing they have been holding carefully for a long time is no longer required to be held quite so carefully. Not release, exactly. More like the careful setting down of a thing that has been carried a long way, placed on a surface that can support it. I was here because of the commodity irregularities, she said. The classification pattern you flagged. It connects to something larger, an embargo being constructed around the carrath-pell corridor by a faction within the Outer Trade Commission. I needed to see the hub itself, the actual flow, the actual paperwork, the actual pattern at the level 4 desks, before my fleet arrives to address it. I thought it might be something like that, I said. You thought it might be something like that, and you proceeded as filed. Yes. She looked at the paper log, she looked at the entry, she looked at me. The Veth sovereignty owes Carrath-pell a trade corridor audit, she said. The GCR will be notified this week. The clearance team here will be the point of contact for the documentation review. I'll note that in the system, I said. Level 4 clearance team, she said, specifically. I looked at her, understood. She picked up her notebook. She held it for a moment. Below us, the approach dock was producing the sounds it made when a significant transit was preparing, not the ordinary shuttle sounds or the tug-in cradle sounds of freight handling, but something bigger, the deep resonance of large-class docking seals and the particular hum of a ship whose drive systems were running at standby. And then another, and another. The fleet arrived this morning, she said. Pre-dawn approach. They've been holding at outer dock to avoid drawing attention while my posting completed. I nodded. A fleet, of course. 7 months ago, when I had read the verification lock and looked at the restriction tier and decided what to do, I had not been able to see the specific details of the sealed record. But I had understood the structural implication, that someone who warranted that tier of restriction was not a mid-rank customs attaché, and that the difference between their actual rank and their filed rank was not a clerical error. The restriction tier had been the highest I had seen. The file behind the lock was older and deeper in the system than anything I had access to. And she had come here in person, unannounced, in a Delegate 3 coat with a notebook, to sit in a level 4 cafe for 30 days and watch an approach dock and write in narrow pages. "They'll be visible from the level 4 window," I said, "once they undock and take approach formation." She looked at me. For a moment the carefully contained expression that she had maintained for 30 days in the transit corridor at my desk in the second chair by the window of the copper kettle was not quite as contained as it had been. Not much. A small thing. The kind of shift you could miss if you were not used to watching people carefully. But I was used to watching people carefully, it being a significant part of the job. "Yes," she said, "they will." She turned. She walked toward the panel that led to the copper kettle, and I thought she was going to stop at the window for one last look. She did not. She walked through the panel and through the copper kettle. I could see her moving through the frosted section, the narrow dark shape of her coat, and out the far side toward the transit corridor that led to the main departure gates. I sat at my desk. I turned the paper log back to face me. I looked at the 8 words in the note's personal column. Then I looked up at the level 4 window, the long floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the approach dock. The cradles were shifting. The configuration of the dock was changing in the way it changes when something larger than a standard transit is preparing to move, the tug positions adjusting, the cradle arms withdrawing to their maximum extent, the exterior lighting on the dock face cycling to approach-ready amber. They came out of the outer dock slowly, the way large-class ships always do, because there is no way to move something of that mass quickly without risking the dock structure and everyone inside it. They came one at a time at first, and then in formation as the outer dock configuration allowed it. 7 ships. I counted 7, and then lost count because the formation was spreading across the approach corridor in a pattern that did not fit my visual angle from the level 4 window. The ships that I could see clearly were not the largest I had seen at Carrath-pell. There are commercial haulers that exceed them in raw displacement. What made them different was the way they held their formation. Without the adjustments and corrections that characterize commercial fleets, without the slight drift and recovery that even experienced civilian pilots produce when they are holding station in a multi-ship array. These ships held their positions as if they had been set there by a hand that did not waver, and the formation they held was not a transit formation, not the loose cluster of inbound traffic or the single-file queue of freight. It was something else, something that had a name I did not know but that I recognized by its quality, the quality of being arranged with intention. I watched them for a while. The approach dock settled into the particular quiet it reaches when something large has departed or is departing, not the absence of activity, but the pause between activities, the held breath before the next cycle of ordinary work begins. I turned back to my desk. There were 16 forms in the stack I had been working through before 11:20. I picked up the next one. It was a standard small trader commodity certificate, the kind I process 200 times a cycle. I stamped it, logged it, set it aside. I reached for the following one. Outside the window, the fleet was moving into transit approach, the ship's drive signatures creating the faint vibration in the floor that you feel when something is really moving, not just positioning. I had felt that vibration twice before at Carrath-pell, both times from large-class commercial transports. This was different in register, not louder but deeper, the kind of frequency that you feel in the chest rather than the ears, and that takes longer to fade after the source has moved away. I stamped the second form, I logged it, I reached for the third. There is a question I have not answered because I am not sure it has an answer, which is whether what I did 7 months ago, and in the 30 days that followed, was the right thing. A different officer, most officers, I think, would have referred the verification lock to level 7. Level 7 would have opened the sealed record, and understood what it contained and assembled the appropriate protocol team at the docking cradle for when she arrived. There would have been ceremony. There would have been the correct acknowledgement of the correct tier of authority. The posting would not have happened. The chair by the window would not have been relevant. I think about the word tired. I think about the question she asked me, whether it had occurred to me that there might be people who found the way I worked here useful, not because they couldn't manage the performance, because they were tired of it. I think that was the closest she came to telling me directly, and I think she knew I understood it as such. The conversation had the quality of two people saying something true by indirect means, because the direct means would require one of them to step outside the terms they had both agreed to maintain, and neither of them was willing to do that, and neither of them needed to. The exit clearance slip is in the system under Solon Verath, Delegate 3, posting complete. The commodity irregularity flag I filed 6 weeks ago is in the Level 4 log, cross-referenced against the audit note I wrote this morning marking it as pending GCR review. The paper log is on my desk, open to the current week. In the notes personal column for today's date, I have written 4 words, not 8, 4 words, which is all the entry requires. File closed, she said so. I processed the 3rd form, and then the 4th, and then the 5th. The fleet moved through approach, and the vibration in the floor eased gradually as the drive signatures shifted from departure profile to transit profile, which is to say they were no longer pushing against carrath-pell's mass but moving with the corridor. The approach dock settled into its ordinary configuration. The tug pilots returned to their standard positions. The cradle arms reset. At 1300, the corridor filled again with freight agents and their manifests. I processed the afternoon stack without incident. At 1500, I wrote up the corridor audit note that Level 7 had asked for, citing the commodity irregularity pattern and nodding the anticipated GCR contact from the Veth sovereignty. At 1630, I closed the log for the day and put on my coat and took the lift to the transit level and walked out through the main entrance and into the hub's common corridor. The commissary on Level 2 was still open. I bought a cup of pressed grain tea, which is the kind she had been drinking every visit for 30 days. I know this because the copper kettle's self-service dispenser labels its options clearly, and I had been processing forms 10 feet from the dispenser for 30 days, and I pay attention to things. I had never tried it myself. I stood at the Level 2 corridor window, which does not look out over the approach dock but over the inner transit hall, and I drank it and thought that it was not bad. A little more complex than the standard grain tea, a little warmer in the finish, not dramatic. The kind of thing you could drink every day and not tire of, if you were the kind of person who drank the same thing every day. I had waited 11 years to try it for no particular reason, which is not a good reason to have waited. Most things that turn out to be unremarkably good are that way because they are quiet and steady rather than notable, and quietness and steadiness are not the qualities that make a thing easy to notice from a distance. You have to be close to them to see them properly. The next day was Wednesday. I was at my desk by 700. The first form in the stack was a standard freight manifest. I stamped it, logged it, set it aside, and reached for the second.